Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Late last month, the German Economic Institute in Cologne published a report that examines the dependence of the United States on imports from the European Union and Germany in specific. The report, which was commissioned by the German Federal Foreign Office, shows that U.S. dependence on imports from the European Union is on the rise. Joining us to talk about this report is one of the report's co-authors, Dr. Samina Sultan. She's a senior economist for European Economic and Fiscal Policy at the German Economic Institute. Samina, herzlich willkommen. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
So I'm really interested to hear from you about this report. Of course, I had a chance to look at the report. The report has only been published in German so far, so it's not accessible to all of our audience, and that's all the more reason why I'm pleased that you're making the time to talk with us. And I thought it would be interesting for you to share with us some of the key findings of the report. I know that you prepared a few slides to make it tangible for our viewers. And so I thought that that would be a good way of sort of setting the stage for a discussion that you and I can have. And then, of course, I'm also more than happy to fold in questions from our viewers as well.
So thank you once again. And it's true, we only have published the report in English, but there's a short abstract with the most important findings, which is also in English. So if readers are interested in that, then they can at least look at the abstract. But as you mentioned, it's great that I have the opportunity to present this report that we published also in English here, the most important results. And it's about the US import dependency on the EU. And we have a very disaggregated analysis of how the US depends on imports from the EU. So just, just for setting the scene or to motivate why we did this report, I guess most of you know this picture of Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, and Donald Trump came up with this deal about the trade agreement between the US and the EU. And in a sense, it was in the media in Germany, at least, it was portrayed as, a sign of weakness that we came up with this deal, which is sort of puts the EU and Germany or gives the EU and Germany sort of a bad trade agreement with the US, because now we have to accept these 15% tariff. And it was said that this was sort of reflecting our weakness in comparison to China, which has this leverage by using its rare earth, for example, and whereas the EU only has goods that are not that important to the US. There was a opinion piece in the Financial Times where Gideon Rachman said it was like, the EU only has Gucci handbags and these are not that important to the US, whereas China has these rare earth and therefore has much more leverage to come up with a better trade deal. And so the question is, okay, does the EU really only have that, or is there more to the US dependence, import dependence on the EU? And if you look at just on a broad aggregate of how the EU US imports by selected countries or selected country groups, you see that the EU import share of total imports from of the US has actually increased from 14% in 2010 to now 18% in 2024. And in comparison, China's import share has decreased over that time period. So the EU is actually more important on aggregate than China as an import partner to the US. Germany is about 5%, a share which hasn't changed much. And you can also see that, for example, Mexico has increased in importance, and also Vietnam. And also, obviously, these are two countries that are suspected to sort of be used as rerouting of China through these two countries. But nevertheless, we see that the EU, or the importance of the EU as an import partner of the US, is actually very important. So this is the aggregate picture, but our report now goes at the disaggregated level, where we, this is sort of technical, go to the 10-digit level according to the harmonized tariff schedule, which is the most disaggregate level you can look at product categories. And we then compute at this disaggregated level what is the EU share of total US imports from, and we look at the time period 2010 to 2024. We're using data from the US Department of Commerce to look at if it's really true that the import share or the US dependence on the EU is so small that we don't have any leverage. So let me present you some of the most important results. If we look at the US dependence on this disaggregated level and look at the distribution of the US import dependence, you can see here for different distributions, for example, the number of products where the EU has an import share of at least 30%, it's actually over 5,000 products. And for example, at the US import share on the EU of more than 50% is actually, it's the case for more than 3,000 products in 2024. And the US depends on the EU completely for 293 products for all its imports. So you can see that this is actually, quite substantial. And if we look at these products where the US depends on the EU for all of its imports, and just look at what products these are, just to give you an example, what kind of products we're talking about. These are, for example, airplanes, non-military airplanes. So there is a 100% import dependence on the EU for these kind of products. Also, we have like products like cheese or pasta, which are not that important, but you can see there are also a lot of machinery, so there are also products which are important or strategically important, could be strategically important. We've also looked at the development of the US import dependence over time. This is again for the threshold of 50%. You can see it has actually increased over time. So from roughly 2,600 products to now these 3,000 products. And we've also looked at different kind of import thresholds. This is 50%, but you can also look at 90%. It's the same picture. It is obviously at a lower scale, but the amount, but also the amount of, so the value, the US dollar amount, but also the number of products, it has increased over time. This is like a one-off picture, like in 1 year, the number of products where the import threshold is at least 50%, but obviously a dependence on a good is is likely to be even higher if that import dependence is persistent over a longer time frame. So we've also looked at persistent US dependence on the EU. And you can see that for at least the last 5 years, the US import dependence was at least 50% for more than 1,500 products, or since 2015 for 700 products. So, and this is the value-based persistence. So you can see even in this persistent dimension, there are a lot of products where the US depends on the EU for its imports. And we have done a similar analysis so we have done this analysis for the EU as an aggregate, but obviously we've also done this for Germany because we did this also for sort of supported by the German Federal Office. So they were obviously also interested in what the picture looks like for Germany. And what we also found very interesting is to do this whole analysis for China. And I just want to show you this one last picture. So if we compare the US import dependence, where the US depends on more than 50 or at least 50% on the EU or Germany or China, we can see that our or the US import dependence on the EU or is actually larger than on China in the last year. So previously, for example, in 2015, it was the US import dependence on China was still greater, both in the number of goods, but also in total value. But now the EU is actually there is more import dependence on the EU than on China regarding the number of goods, but also the total value in US dollars. I think these are very important and interesting findings. I think, Steve, maybe we stop here and open the floor for questions.
Yeah, Samina, thank you so much for the overview. I guess I have a couple of questions sort of right off the bat. One is, I think in the very first slide that you showed us, um, it looked as if import dependence on Japan had also decreased, right? I mean, it looked like there was a tick up for Europe, and then you had mentioned that also an increase as far as Mexico and Vietnam were concerned. You talked a little bit about the decrease as far as China is concerned, but not, I don't think you mentioned Japan.
Yeah.
Is it worth saying a few things about that decrease?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Japan was, I think, before China became the main target of de-risking, I think there was the same debate about Japan and how the US wants to sort of de-risk from Japan. Also, obviously, we didn't use that term at that time, but Japan was a manufacturing powerhouse previously or a few years ago. It's not anymore, and the economy is also not doing that well. But I think that can maybe explain that decline. And it's a share, of US import dependence. So if the share of the EU increases or the share of China increases, then this also has an impact on the share of Japan. But I think maybe that can explain.
So I find this study really interesting because I think it sort of breaks with conventional thinking on a number of levels, right? People generally assume that there's a greater dependence on China, and certainly that was the case based on your findings. As recently as a decade ago, certainly
Yeah.
15 years ago. Um, do you have a explanation for why there's been this flip over the last 10 to 15 years? Because, the charts that you showed
Yeah.
do show a narrowing, and then, the import dependence on Europe suddenly surpassing the import dependence on China. What are some of the factors behind that?
Yeah, I mean, in 2015, the peak was in 2015 of the US import dependence on China. And 2016, we had the US election. And I think, especially during Trump, we did see, during Trump's first presidency, we did see this increased focus on China and reducing dependence on China. And we also had the tariffs, the first tariffs under his first presidency. So I think this gave a push or raised the awareness of how dependent the US is on China and this drive to de-risk from China. So I think this can explain this decrease of China's import relevance for the US. And obviously then China also tried this rerouting through Mexico and Vietnam, for example. So I think that also needs to be factored in. But I think this can explain the timing of why we see this starting in 2015. And also during Biden's presidency, most of the tariffs on China weren't revoked, so they stayed in place. So I think that can explain this trend that we see in the data.
No, I mean that makes sense. And I guess one other thing I'd be interested in having you unpack a little bit more is whether you see these trends for all goods in all sectors, or whether it's more dominant in some sectors or for some goods, that there might be some areas where the United States continues to be heavily dependent on China, but
Mm,
where um, just because of the value of the goods, it's ticking the numbers up for the Europeans. Because I think it's interesting, right? One has to make this distinction that these numbers that you've presented are in U.S. dollar amount, but also in
mm,
the number of products that
mm.
are being imported by the U.S. And I'm just curious whether there are any sectoral differences there as well.
Yeah. I have to say, like in this analysis, we focused mostly on the EU and the importance of the EU for the US. So we didn't look too much into China. I think this would be an interesting, follow-up question. So we didn't look into the US import dependence on China in that report too much. So I cannot answer that question actually. And you mentioned that we always looked at number of goods and also the total trade value, because I think that is an important aspect. I learned that from we did a study before where we looked at the export strength of Germany and in which products Germany is still export champion. And
Hmm.
there we only focus on the number of goods. And one of the questions that kept on coming up was, okay, you've only looked at the number of goods, but you should also look at the amount, the dollar or the euro amount. So that was something I learned. We need to do both. And I think there's a good reason for both ways of looking at it, because sometimes you have very not very valuable goods, but if they are missing, they're actually very important. So
Hmm.
sometimes the dollar value is, misleading. But I think it's fair to do both ways of or to do the
Hmm.
analysis for both ways of looking at it, um, because yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So we're receiving a number of, I think, really interesting questions from some of our viewers, and one of them asks how much you've taken an increase in local production in the US into
Mm,
account for
mm.
some of the dependence metrics that you're sharing. Does this play a role in maybe the shift as well, that there's more production in the US instead of in China, and so that's had an impact rather than European imports really increasing that much over China and Chinese imports decreasing?
Yeah, I mean, we ideally would be, controlling for U.S. production. It's unfortunately not possible because the classification for exports and imports, so foreign trade, is different than for local production. So we cannot easily combine these two data sets. So what we did for a further analysis, which we call the focus analysis, we sort of clean the data for where the US exports more than it imports. So that's, we sort of use that as a proxy. If the US exports more than it imports of a good, then we say, okay, then it's very likely that it has local production because it can export more than it imports. But
Hmm.
obviously that is, just a proxy because we cannot use production, or we don't have production data at the same level than we have the import data. So in a later stage of the analysis, we control for this export share, and then we sort of do a strategic analysis of where there are strategic dependencies on the EU.
Hmm. Okay. That makes sense. Someone just submitted a question that actually goes in the direction that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is a lot of the figures that you've shared are basically through the end of 2024. And
Mm,
we literally, just today are entering the fourth quarter of 2025. And so the question is, what indicators are there for these trends? What
mm.
might we expect in the 2025 data? And beyond. And I guess, I mean, obviously you need a crystal ball in order to give us real insights, but I think this is an interesting question from the viewer, but I also wanted to ask you related to that, how do you think the more recent tariff policies
Mhm.
of the Trump administration might affect some of these trends?
Yeah, very difficult questions. So let me think about this. I think it's very difficult to tell because at the beginning of the year, we had an increase of our exports to the US, sort of front loading because people were expecting tariffs. So I guess this could even have increased our share, but at the same time, they were also front loading Chinese imports. So this is very, very difficult to say.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, as I think the recent, like since we have the 15%, I think our exports to the US have declined, at least for Germany. I can't say EU as a whole. So I'm afraid I cannot give, a very good answer to that question because the picture is so fuzzy at the moment still. But I would think that at least for the first half of the year, there was a lot of front loading, just to get as much into the US as before the tariffs come. So I would say maybe there's even a higher share for the EU, and because we had tariffs for China coming in as early as February,
Hmm.
um, their share might have even declined. But this is, I'm sort of guessing right now. So this is what I could say about, yeah, and I guess your question goes in the same direction. So
I mean, again, this is part of this is
yeah,
speculation, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
even for a report that was just published in late September,
mm,
you didn't have 2025 data, but I'm
no,
sure that this
no,
is something that you're continuing to follow. And of course,
yeah,
there have been some particular developments since the beginning of this year, which
yeah.
obviously have an impact on this as well. So, I mean, I think this is an important snapshot and a very important trend that you and your co-author have identified. Um, but it's one where we just don't know right now how that trend will continue.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this since January 2025, I think it is very hard to say that the trend we had the previous years continues because it's just such a fundamental disruption to transatlantic trade relations that I think it would be wrong just to extrapolate the trend we had previously to the years before because I would say, as I said, I think we would. I mean, my gut feeling would be we would even have an increase and then towards the end of the year, maybe a decrease. So I don't know. I think it's very hard to say that the trend of the last 10 to 15 years would be a good predictor for what we can expect in 2025 because it's just such a fundamental move. Like,
Hmm.
and um, I mean, the motivation of the report was not so much to give a picture for 2025, but to use this analysis as, is it really the case that the US is not dependent on us, on the EU? Is China so much more important, or what is our weight in negotiations with the US? That was more the aim of the report.
Hmm. Hmm. That makes sense. One thing that often comes up at ACG events when we talk about trade imbalances is that we're often looking just at goods and
Mm,
not at services
mm,
as well. And one of our viewers is curious
mm,
whether this is something that you considered as well
mm,
as
mm,
we're doing this research, because it certainly seems from the numbers that you presented
mm.
that you're really talking about goods. And
Exactly.
can you
Yes.
talk a little bit
Yes.
about the
Yes.
service sector
Yeah,
as
I
well.
should I should have mentioned this before or made it more clear. I'm talking here about goods trade, so not service trade. And service trade certainly deserves more attention because, I mean, the big thing about the goods trade is that U.S. has a deficit vis-a-vis the world, but also vis-a-vis the EU, and that is one of the things that Donald Trump doesn't like. So that's one of the reasons he gives for unfolding his tariff war. But on service trade, the picture looks completely different. There, the U.S. actually has a surplus with the EU, so it exports more than it imports. We have not, or there's the problem always with service trade is that the data is, or, there's not a lot of good data on service trade, and the data we have on service trade is always insufficient because it's so difficult to report it. But actually, just to give a sort of preview, we are doing a study on service trade,
Mhm.
on EU service trade. But I cannot say too much about it right now. But I fully agree that this is an area that deserves more attention, and also we need better data. But yeah.
Well, Samina, we'll have to have you come back when that new study on services has been completed, and we can have sort of a part two that focuses
Mm,
on the service sector. Um, there have been a couple of questions that have come in that also raise another factor that I think is worth considering, and that is, of course, there are a number of big German companies, but also
mm,
Japanese companies
mm,
that manufacture in the United States, right? I'm thinking
mm,
particularly about the German automotive sector.
mm.
How does that manufacturing in the US have an impact, or does the manufacturing in the US have an impact on some of these numbers that you're looking at?
Yes, it does, because it sort of reflects also, even if a German company, for example, sets up a plant in the US, it mostly still needs components from the EU or from Germany or from anywhere else. So the stronger these transatlantic relations are, also in terms of foreign direct investment, it is also likely to have an impact on trade relations, because
Hmm.
it's likely that then the trade relations become even bigger. So that reflects that in terms of FDI or foreign direct investment, the EU and the US are also very closely related, and that relationship has grown stronger over time. And in that pursuit, also trade relations have become more important.
Hmm.
But it just, just one point, it just makes clear again, or that question, that trade alone is not sufficient to reflect the importance of the transatlantic relations, but that foreign direct investment is another very important part of the puzzle, and that they sort of are, they are very interconnected, these two aspects. So if you have more foreign direct investment, it's also likely that you have more trade, and that we are living in a very globalized world where a good is mostly not just manufactured in one place, but it crosses borders many times, and in
Hmm.
our case crosses the Atlantic.
Hmm. So, I mean, I guess this is a good segue. One of the things that any good sort of academic report has is often policy recommendations
Mm,
about how to address the current situation. And so, I know that your report had a number of policy recommendations. I think it would be really interesting to have you share those with us, but then also put it in the context of some of the unknowns that you were just
mm,
talking about. These are policy recommendations that are
mm,
being made based on data through the end of 2024. Here we are in 2025. Some of the Rahmenbedingungen, some of the
mm,
framework within
mm,
which we're operating is shifting and evolving.
mm.
Do you think those policy recommendations hold true, or do they need to be reconsidered as well in light of the developments over the last 9 months?
Yeah. So, we have just presented this report last week at the foreign ministry, and there were also people from different other ministries from for example, the economy ministry, economics ministry, and also the chancellery. So they also had a lot of questions, and one of our most important policy implications is that this analysis is a first shot at, our or the U.S. import dependence on us, but there are many caveats which we've also touched upon in our Q&A. And so we really find it very important that, these kind of analysis is done regularly and also at a very granular level. So we find it very important that we have sort of a government-based task force that, analyzes our international value chain in order to really evaluate critical import dependence in trade, not only U.S. import relations, but also with China. But this needs to be, something that is on the radar of the German government, which so far does not do something like that. For example, the government of the UK has such a task force and is much more strategic about this value chain analysis in comparison to the German government. And then, a second policy recommendation, which draws from the conclusions of the report, is that we do see that the U.S. import dependence on the EU is stronger than normally, expected, and this gives us a stronger position in any further trade negotiations. And we see that even though we have the U.S. deal, the U.S.-EU deal now, there's still a lot of uncertainty. For example, we just had this new list of products which come onto a list with 50% tariff. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, and I think negotiations will continue. And with knowing that there is the U.S. import dependence on the EU is so much bigger than we think, I think it's also very unlikely that the US can afford to escalate the trade conflict with the EU. And we should go into trade negotiations with this in our, knowing this. So even though we obviously have this dependence on the US in military regards, for example, the support for the Ukraine, knowing that the US also needs our imports. And if, for example, value chains break down, or the US can't get certain goods, or goods become more expensive and drive up inflation, this would have hurt the US. And in the same way that Donald Trump was not willing to escalate the trade conflict with China, I think he would also not be able to sustain an escalation of the trade conflict with the EU. Mm-hmm. So I think this is one of the most important lessons that we want policymakers to take from this report.
So I guess, a couple of follow-up questions to that. One is, did you find that there was appetite on the part of the government to think about this kind of a task force that would look at international value chains, or was the idea kind of, sure, that's a nice to have, but not really a priority for us right now, given everything else that's going on?
I mean, I think some of the people in the room were interested in the idea. They think it would be a good idea, but I think they're not there to implement it during this term of the coalition. Yeah, I mean,
so that's that's interesting, because this coalition is new, right? It's still in its early phases, and it could establish some new opportunities for assessment and evaluation. But I guess, it might mean it's a good thing for you and your institute, because some of this work can be outsourced to you to track this and then inform government officials, but also the public. And that sort of leads to a second question. Your presentation started with that photograph of Ursula von der Leyen and President Trump, and you talked about the perception of the US-EU trade deal being not as good for Europe as it possibly could have been. I think your study shows that the EU is in a stronger position than many people previously thought vis-a-vis the US. This could give the EU a little bit of a leg up when it comes to future negotiations, when it comes to other negotiations, but is part of the goal also to increase awareness among the public about, we Europeans are in a stronger position than some people might think.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think in the media, this deal was said, as I said, was sort of portrayed as not good enough. But if you ask my opinion, I think it just reflects sort of our dependence on the US in terms of military support. I think this sort of, it's not a ideal solution in terms of what we would have hoped for in terms of economically best solution, but it's just realpolitik in a way. It reflects that in other dimensions, and at that time we are dependent on the US in this military or in security related aspects. So I think it's not fair to say the EU Commission sort of failed in negotiating with the US. I think that's easily said, but
But I think, I think this is maybe a little bit of a generalization, but I think that one of the things that we are seeing with the Trump administration is how the playing field or the board is changing in as much as previous administrations have kept, trade issues in one lane and security issues in another lane and negotiated separately. And what we're seeing now is, that these are coming together, becoming intertwined. And so it makes it very difficult to completely just separate out what Europe's trade interests are versus what its security interests are.
I fully agree.
And that has to be a factor here as well. How much, I guess, from the Institute's standpoint, this is a useful study for Germany, but also for Europe. How much thought have you given to sort of presenting this in Brussels? Because I would think it would have wider resonance beyond Germany. And so having a report that's maybe in English or even in French as well could be very useful in terms of helping other Europeans understand where this relationship is.
Yeah, so our plans for November are to present it in Brussels. We are just planning an event in beginning of November where we will be in Brussels presenting it. It's just, we're in the planning process, so who will be there, we don't know. But obviously also the German Foreign Ministry has an, interest in us presenting it over there. So I guess we'll get support also from their side in sort of, pushing the message, and spreading the message. And, it was picked up in the media a lot. We gave it, we had published it exclusively with Reuters. I don't know if you know it. So they also, made a short summary of it in English and published it in the English media. So it could have been picked up over there, but then obviously the German newspapers, picked it up more than the English-speaking ones. And yeah, I mean, I'm here to spread the message also over here. So yeah.
So, switching gears a little bit, something that you and I have talked about before is just sort of the state of the German economy right now. I think most of our viewers will be aware that there are some concerns about the state of the German economy with low or no growth rates, with concerns over skilled labor, with, who would have thought that companies like Volkswagen would close plants in Germany? A fair amount of sort of concern and anguish about the future of the German economy. And yet, as one of our recent speakers in New York pointed out, look, Germany still has the third largest economy globally. There are a number of factors that are positive when it comes to the German economy. What's sort of your take on where the German economy is right now? And maybe related to that, because a portion of our conversation has had to do with government recommendations, there is a new administration, and there's a new economics minister who has a sort of industrial policy or economic policy that she's putting out there. Is that something that gives you some hope that the German economy might, pick up again, but also maybe you'll say that the German economy is getting a bad rap in a lot of these media reports, and even though there are some construction sites, things are not as bad as it's sometimes portrayed.
Yeah, I mean, I've started this, or I've given, presented a report about our export relationship with the US. And I think that will be part of my answer, because Germany has relied on the export for its growth during the last few decades. And we
Certainly
see
throughout
that.
the post-World War II period, right? I mean,
Exactly.
export-led
Yeah.
growth was
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
Wirtschaftswunder
Yeah.
that contributed
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
prosperity in Germany.
Yes, and I think we are starting to realize that this doesn't work anymore. The export relationship with China is increasingly becoming more difficult. China is itself betting on or putting greater emphasis on export because its internal economy isn't going that well. So China wants to become an export powerhouse itself, not becoming, it is an export powerhouse. So our export share in China is decreasing, so that doesn't work anymore. So the new hope was the US. In comes President Trump and destroys that plan. So 10% of our exports are going to the US, and that really has an important impact for important industry like the machinery, like the automobile sector. So I think we need to realize that that doesn't work anymore. And then we still have the war between Russia and Ukraine. So that had the impact of increasing energy prices. So cheap energy from Russia doesn't work anymore. That puts our energy intensive industry under strain. So a lot of pillars that we've usually relied on for the German economic model are under extreme strain. So I think the turning point or Zeitenwende that already Olaf Scholz called out during his years in office are even more important now or after January of this year, with our transatlantic trade relations coming under strain. So I think this focus on strengthening our internal demand and investment that this government has put in place is the right direction. Now it really depends on how this money is spent. if it's only spent on consumption or if it's really spent on investment and bringing our competitiveness into forefront again, because Germany is losing out on competitiveness over the last few years, and our infrastructure is in bad conditions. So I think there is this push for new investment, or this provision of new money is good and is a good first move, but now it really depends on how this money is spent. We do see some signs that money is not spent in the most appropriate way. And we also need structural reforms. For example, pension reform is needed. And these are very difficult reforms to deal with for any government. But given, the global or geopolitical tensions everywhere on the world, will be even more difficult.
So I guess in light of that, where do you think the Europeans are looking for other export opportunities, right? One of our viewers just asked about the role of the EU-Mercosur agreement of trade between the European Union and a large part of South America, the countries of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Do you think that could provide sort of a necessary export outlet or export market, if you will?
That's a third policy recommendation we have, that we really need to go for diversification and not just, have it as a buzzword hanging around in the air. And that really means our trade negotiations need to become more successful, because we have, the EU has failed to sign free trade agreements in the past, and especially the Mercosur EU free trade agreement really needs to be signed, needs to get into effect by the end of the year. I really hope that all countries in the EU recognize that we need that trade agreement, not only for our economic relations, but also as a geopolitical sign that we reach out to countries, that we are a reliable trade partner. So I really hope that trade deal comes into effect, but also India, Indonesia are important countries. I would also say Australia. The trade agreement in 2024 didn't wasn't successful because of agriculture. So I hope that also comes into effect. Also, Canada. But
So,
I would really agree that this is something we need to go ahead and.
I mean, I think the German market is not big enough to sustain a lot of the companies, even as Germany starts to think about focusing more on its domestic market than the export market as well. And so it's a question of finding other export opportunities in other countries where German goods can be exported if there are these challenges. And certainly with some of the new import tariffs that have been announced by the US, including 100% duties on patented drugs and 25% on heavy duty trucks, and things like that, there's a new sense of uncertainty when it comes to trade. I think in one news report I saw was that despite this level of import tariffs that were announced by Washington, Germans think that there will be about a 15% tariff on pharmaceuticals and heavy trucks. And the US government later said that it would honor 15% caps. But how do you think the German pharmaceutical industry might be affected?
Yeah, I mean, when this news came out last Friday, I think a lot of people were panicking here, because our exports in the pharmaceutical sector to the US are even higher than an average. I mean, 10% of our overall exports go to the US, but in the pharmaceutical sector, it's 25%. So that sector really depends also on the US as an export market, you can flip that coin. At the same time, the US depends on our imports in that sector. Now that we have the 15%, it's not as bad as it could be, but still, it's worse than it was before, because before we had 0%. Obviously, then you have an exemption for generica. I think it's called generica in English as well. So this only applies to, more innovative medicines, but that is the kind of things we produce here in Germany. So that's not good news. But then it's also the case that he said any company that has invested in the US is exempted from these tariffs. So I think we have to sort of, see what happens, which companies are affected, how that is actually calculated, because is it sufficient if you have one plant in the US that you are exempted, or does the whole thing need to be produced in the US? So I think again, as we have seen previously, a lot of things are still unclear. Yeah.
No, I think that makes sense. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns. I guess one of the sort of things that came up as I was reading the report and then also listening to you about some of the policy recommendations is, do you have a sense that there is a greater sense of urgency on the part of some of the decision makers and opinion leaders that one has to maybe nail down some of these new trade agreements more quickly and not, postpone the negotiations, but really try to move forward rapidly, because there is so much uncertainty, and that would contribute to a greater sense of certainty.
I think I can only speak here for the German government. I think yes, especially under now with the new government, Merz has really pushed this that we need free trade agreements, that we need to go ahead with these negotiations, that they need to be successful. But the stumbling block at the moment is France. We need a qualified majority for it to pass in the council, the agreement, for example, with the Mercosur states. And the situation in France is very unstable with the government, and especially the left has some problems with the trade agreement. So I think we'll see what happens. My hope is that France maybe can abstain from at least not voting against the agreement. That would be enough, because I think it's quite certain that we'll have other countries not voting for it. For example, Austria won't agree. But that's in the arithmetic of how votes are counted in the EU, it would be okay if Austria doesn't agree, but we need France to agree, just because it would be a really bad sign if you do something against France with such an important decision.
Maybe this is a subject for a future conversation that we can have, sort of looking at the Franco-German engine and how strong it is, given the domestic political concerns, particularly in France, and the fact that Macron is a bit of a lame duck at this point, while Friedrich Merz is new in his role, and see how this tandem, which has played such an important role for European development and for the European economy, might continue on. So maybe that's a topic for another day. But I'd like to maybe close with a different question that was submitted by one of our viewers, and I don't know if this is something that you have a view on, but of course, as of today, as of midnight, 1 minute past midnight, the U.S. government finds itself in a shutdown. And one of our viewers is curious whether you have any thoughts on how political Berlin, how Germany is watching the current situation in the U.S., and what some of the thoughts and concerns might be about the impact internationally of the government shutdown here in the U.S.
I haven't seen the reactions of the German government yet to the shutdown. I can say what I think of it myself. I think it's really reflects that we have such a partisan divide in the US that you cannot even agree, on a household.
On a budget, yeah.
On a budget, sorry, yes. So, I think that really, that again stresses that divide, and that even on such an important topic that you cannot find agreement. I mean, during the last Ampelregierung, so the traffic light coalition, they also, it was also the budget question that led to the solution of that government. That's maybe how much I would say regarding that situation. I mean, and also, I mean, as I understood, Trump is sort of, or the Democrats want Trump to not pass some of the like the cuts to Medicaid and like in that sector. So I hope they can find some sort of agreement, but that's maybe how much I can say to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, again, we're dealing with lots of unknowns, and in this case, sort of a evolving story, which is changing. I think that there's some hope that the government shutdown will not last very long. But as you talked about, there are these hard lines. I often find myself talking about sort of the calcification of positions that we're seeing in Washington, and that makes it very, very difficult to make compromises and achieve consensus to move forward. And we're seeing one of those moments right now where there appears not to be a move forward. You kind of have to hope that there are some conversations going on behind the scenes, and that there will ultimately be a resolution to this.
Obviously, yeah. I think we all hope for that, but you put it very nicely. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Samina, herzlichen Dank. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation and exchange. Definitely keep us posted about further studies. I do think that the study that's focusing on the service sector will be interesting. But I also think that if you and your colleagues end up sort of adding a PS to this study as more data comes in related to 2025, that would be very interesting to revisit as well. So I'd love to stay in touch about that and about other topics. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us.
Thank you for having me.